Welcome to our afternoon session on this session on environment, energy, and resources. My name is Mark Cameron. I'm the energy practice lead with Hill+Knowlton Canada, a public relations, public affairs firm, and I'm also on the advisory committee of sustainable prosperity. So I'm just declaring my conflict with Stewart, which is both real and perceived conflict. We have a very distinguished panel. Stewart Elgie is a professor of law and economics at the University of Ottawa. Has been an activist in environmental law for many years, founder of Sierra Legal Defense, which later became Eco-Justice, and then now with Sustainable Prosperity in the Institute of the Environment. Andrew-Leach, economist at the University of Alberta, very well known for his views and tweets on energy and resource issues. Madelaine Drohan, writer with The Economist, and Nick Rivers, also with the University of Ottawa, who has been very involved in forecasting on GHG emissions and a number of other things. So we've got papers by Stewart and Andrew, which they'll present, and then Madelaine and Nick will give the right of reply. So let's start with Stewart. I think these mics aren't working, so everyone's going to have to come up individually to the microphone.
Yeah, still a squeaky stage. So. Thanks for the compliment and saying I had a paper. The truth of it is I was a late invitee to this event, and so I do not yet have a paper, but I did accept because I thought it was the last chance I would ever have to be invited to speak at a youth leaders forum, and so I figured I better sneak in under that one while the going was good. They didn't check ID, luckily. I feel like a Chinese Olympian or something. I probably had to break some human rights code thing, but anyway. This paper, therefore, that's my long way of saying my presentation will be rougher than some of the others, but the good news is I plan to use you guys ruthlessly to help me write the paper, so the feedback and discussion you give will make my job far easier. My charge here from Roland is to explore Canada's response to global environmental trends, particularly climate. I'm going to make two arguments in the paper, but really focus on the first one today, which is how should Canada respond domestically, economically, to the global shift towards a low-carbon economy? The elevator version of this pitch, if you want to tune out after this, is essentially that the world is shifting towards a lower carbon economy. We should see this shift as an opportunity, not as a threat. That it is possible for a resource-intensive economy like us to prosper in a greening world. But doing that means a different policy approach than the one we've been pursuing, one that harnesses market forests and forces to accelerate clean innovation. And my working title is Brown Meets Green. Open to feedback on that too. So for those of you who want to continue listening, here's the 10-minute version. So the world is moving towards what many people call low-carbon, green, resource-efficient economy. And essentially what it means, I think, is that companies and countries that are energy-efficient, low-polluting, eco-innovative, and that use natural capital productively are likely to be ones that succeed in the economy of tomorrow. There's lots of debate legitimately about what the pace of this change is, but that it's happening seems almost unarguable at this point. In the paper, I'll have a bunch of quotes from banks, economic institutions, corporate CEOs, surveys, all of whom indicate that this trend is big. I'll give you one example. The recent PricewaterhouseCoopers survey of 1,000 global corporate CEOs found 63% of them said sustainability is going to transform their industry within 5 years, and 76% thought investing in sustainability will drive revenue and growth and new opportunities. So there's quotes from the IMF, the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and others talking about similar trends. The other thing that's, you can see the early signs of the shift already, and probably the best way to see it is to look at things that we consider green industries, clean tech, clean energy, electric vehicles. All of them are growing several times or more the pace of the rest of their sector over the past decades, and those trends are projected to continue and, if anything, accelerate into the future. So I guess I say trust me on that one. What's driving this? Well, really two competing things are driving it. One is, I was looking at that slide, it shouldn't even be up there, ignore that slide. Although actually I'm about to come to it, so that's good. So one is that economic growth and population growth obviously is going this way, particularly in the developing world, and they're running into increasing resource scarcity and increasing ecological limits. So basically economic and population growth meets resource and environmental scarcity, and scarcity drives value, right? That's the main rule of economics. So rather than thinking of this just as an environmental problem, which it is, it's also an economic reality. Those things that are scarce will become more valuable. So companies that find innovative ways to use natural capital productively and reduce their environmental footprint in all sectors are likely to be the ones that get a market edge in the economy of tomorrow in dealing with this scarcity. I mean, simply put, probably for the first time in human history, natural capital is becoming a significant limiting factor on human economic growth on a wide scale. It's happened locally and regionally before, but it's now happening globally. And many of the lessons we've learned in managing scarcity of human capital over the last 200 years will now apply to how we manage scarcity of natural capital. Now, obviously, I'm vastly oversimplifying complex economic trends here, the nature of 10-minute talks. And obviously, not all resources are becoming scarce. But many of them are. So if you look at environmental thresholds, things like carbon, obviously, drinking water scarcity is becoming a huge issue in most of the world, biodiversity loss, record rates, deforestation. So there are a number of things that are at or beyond sustainable ecological thresholds already. On resources, we could talk about each one, but generally this is where this slide comes in, is that if you look, resource values have generally been dropping for a century, and they've more than doubled in the last 15 years, and that says scarcity, right? Things get more valuable when they get scarce. So that's the world's recognition that resources as a whole are becoming more scarce as their price is going up. What does this mean for Canada? If that's my quick survey of the international scene. Well, let's start by talking about the elephant in the room, which is that we are a high carbon emitter and producer in an increasingly carbon constrained world. More generally, we have an economy that's heavy on oil and natural resources compared to the OECD. We rank near the bottom of the OECD in terms of carbon emissions, pollution, resource consumption per capita, and water consumption. So simply put, we have a fairly brown economy in a greening world. What do we do about that, environmentally and economically? And I mean, it's sort of trite to say we could see that as either a threat or an opportunity, and in fact, it's both. Let me paint sort of two ends of the response spectrum of how one might respond to that. So on one end is the environmental argument, which you hear fairly often from NGOs, clean tech companies, some academics, which is that Canada should shift quickly towards a low-carbon green economy. They argue that we should position ourselves as a leader in these rapidly growing clean energy and clean tech sectors and make these the new engines of our economic growth. Instead of hewers of wood and drawers of petroleum, we should become builders of wind turbines and electric vehicles, which sounds good, right? The argument's driven largely by the IPCC and its warning about a 2-degree threshold of global warming and the resulting CO2 reductions and change in the energy mix that all flow from that. And if you follow that logic, the argument is entirely environmentally accurate. The problem is it's economically naive. The fact is that Canada is an economy that is rich in energy and resources. That's not our whole economy, but it's a big part of it. We are a cold, spread-out nation with fairly sprawling cities. We are not going to become Switzerland or the Netherlands overnight. And even if we wanted to do that, the cost of doing so would be tremendous, and the social capital breakdown of doing that would get in the way of doing a lot of things we have to do. So we have to start from the economic hand we're dealt. And work from there. The other thing is these clean tech sectors, while they're growing rapidly, are still a very tiny part of the overall economy. And we're competing with the largest countries on earth that are also trying to position themselves to be leaders in that sectors. And so the odds of Canada out competing China, the US, and Germany for leadership on wind, solar, electric vehicles, batteries, and other sectors is pretty small. Doesn't mean we won't get some of those niches, but we ain't going to win them all. Sorry to bring you down. We just need to think realistically about what our niche is in a greening world. So that's kind of the environmental argument in short and the flaws I see with it. On the other end, let's call it the business as usual argument, or maybe the damn the torpedoes argument, which is that Canada has a lot of energy and resources. Demand for these things is growing in the world. Increasing our production and getting them to market quickly and cheaply can be a major growth engine, particularly as we replace declining manufacturing jobs. And in a simplified way, that's largely the vision of our federal government, right? Let's build pipelines, open up markets for our oil and resources. Let's pare down inefficient environmental rules and processes that add cost and delay in getting there. And in this worldview, the growing global focus on environmental issues is a threat. It stems generally from sort of an environment versus economy mindset, the idea that these two are competing interests and trade-offs. And so that leads to things like saying carbon taxes are job killers or other environmental rules are job killers, because in that mindset they are, right? They're competing issues and you have to pick one or the other. In fact, the whole idea of a green economy is actually seen as a threat. I was on sabbatical at the OECD last year, and one of the senior leaders there, whose name I won't mention, hauled me in my first week and said, "Why is Canada fighting our green growth strategy?" We had a whole lunch, and I gave him my theory, which is basically there's an understandable reason for it, which is that most of the dialogue around green growth posits that there's a green economy and a brown economy, and we do a lot of the brown economy stuff. And the vision of a green economy is largely a Eurocentric vision from countries that have deindustrialized and de-resourced. And so it's hard for Canada to see itself in that picture. There's actually a method to some of the madness of our current approach. I may not fully agree with it, but I don't think it's, an approach with no basis. In the short term, it might actually even be good economic strategy. But I think in the long term, it's dangerously short-sighted and economically naive for two main reasons. The first is that our poor environmental record is quickly becoming an economic liability. It's the reason President Obama, the US environmental movement, and half of Hollywood is blocking the Keystone Pipeline and costing us tens of billions of dollars every year, by the way, right? So the savings on environmental regs are not a good investment. Now, we may eventually get past Keystone, but the drivers of that opposition will not go away. Our oil sands is now the global poster child for the climate change debate. And I acknowledge that there's a fair amount of license taken with the facts on both sides of that debate, as there is in any PR battle, but there's a grain of truth beneath that license. Canada's forestry industry has been through that movie. In the early 90s, they were the global environmental piñata. Remember West Coast market campaigns, Midnight Oil playing on Clayoquot Sound, largest incidence of civil disobedience in Canadian history, right? Well, they eventually decided that after a decade of economic bloodshed, it was in their interest to get the environmental guys on their side rather than working against them. And they completely changed their economic strategy. And they began to see sustainability as an economic opportunity rather than a threat. And they have legitimately not just talked about it, they've repositioned themselves as a global leader in sustainability. They ain't perfect, but they're among the best. And now the same groups that used to campaign against them actually help sell their products to buyers, saying these guys are good guys. So it can be done. Second reason that the current approach is economically naive is that even if you assume Canada should aim to be a major exporter of energy and resources, the question is, what's our niche in that market? Why would someone want to buy their oil, resources, or minerals from Canada as opposed to others? And I would argue that our niche is not to be the cheapest or the fastest producer of those resources. We won't win that battle. Other less democratic countries will outcompete us for low environmental standards and speedy approvals not burdened by public process. We shouldn't aim to be the highest cost producer, but we're not going to be the lowest. And for the same reasons that we don't try to compete by selling our labor more cheaply than anyone else, we shouldn't try to sell our environment more cheaply than anyone else. It's not a smart strategy for an advanced economy. Now, our niche, I think, is rather than to be the fastest producer, is to be the most environmentally responsible producer of resources, including oil, by the way. It's a great niche for us. It aligns with the way the world wants to see us already when they think of Canada as Banff and mountains and lakes. And what we're doing right now actually plays against our brand. In marketing language, it's the stupidest thing you could do. You're actually going against the built-in advantage of the way your customers want to think of your country. And more business leaders get that. I get to talk with a lot of them now, and it's actually shocking how many of them really get this when they're looking down the road. It's why the forest industry shifted in the 90s ahead of governments. It's why you see oil CEOs in Ottawa lobbying for a carbon tax over the last few years, because they know markets are demanding that of them, and it's because they have to make major investments in technology and equipment, and they're worried that those are going to prove to be stranded and wasteful in a world that soon puts a price on carbon and demands much better environmental performance. They'd rather prepare now for the world they have to compete in tomorrow. So in short, the world is shifting to a lower carbon resource efficient green economy. Ignoring this trend or seeing it as a threat is not a great strategy. We should see it as the economic opportunity that it is. But we need to build a made in Canada vision of what a green economy is for a resource intensive economy. And yes, we should try to build strengths in clean economy niches, but recognize those will be small parts of the economy. We don't need to abandon our resources. It's a big part of our economic endowment, but our niche has to be the most environmentally responsible producer of those resources. Made in Canada should become a brand of global environmental leadership across all parts of the economy. And doing this will push our resource industries to be more efficient and innovative in solving those problems, and that innovation will create value. That's where value gets created, in solving some of these challenges, and our challenges can be around resource innovation in a low-impact way, including for the oil sands, by the way. Do you think the oil sands, if we set the right signals, could actually push to become an environmentally responsible producer? They got a ways to go, but the companies think they're up for it. Anyway, there's a longer conversation about how we do that. I'm going to be short because Roland will pull me off the stage if I'm not. But basically, the key thing is to drive investment and corporate resources towards clean innovation. Lots of ways we have to do that, but the two main ones are to put a price on environmental harm and to make major strategic public investments. You need to have both the pull on the market and the push on the market at the same time to accelerate this shift. Pricing pollution, you guys probably know a lot about it. It's the most cost-effective way to achieve an ambitious environmental target. So that's its first clear advantage. Often 30, 40, 50% cheaper than conventional command and control approaches that we've been using for the last 30 years. The second that people talk about less, though, is it also drives innovation. Because unlike a one-size-fits-all environmental limit, with an environmental price, the lower you go, the more money you make. So there's an incentive to keep innovating, and not just to hit the speed limit, but to keep doing better. So it actually drives innovation. It's basically the Porter hypothesis, and it works. And I won't go through these slides now, given the time, in great detail, but there's a slide Nick gave me that shows the relationship on the left axis between carbon taxes and on the bottom axis between fuel consumption per capita. Pretty clear relationship. See the same thing with water. Countries that charge more for water use less of it, and countries that charge less for it use more, and we're on the bottom of that list. Here's BC. In Ottawa, we forget that someone actually put a carbon tax on in Canada, a job-killing carbon tax. This is what happened. Their per capita fuel use has gone down 19% compared to the rest of the country in the 4 years since that carbon tax shift came in, and their GDP has stayed consistent with the rest of the countries in that time. And that's consistent with the experience seen in 6 European countries that brought in carbon taxes in the 90s. In all cases, and this is a model that controls for the economic effects of that influence, GDP has had a slight positive effect, not enough that you'd say it's within sort of the margin of error, but it hasn't hurt the economy. In every case, carbon emissions have gone down. So this stuff isn't just good in theory. The places we've done it, it's actually worked. The second one, I won't talk about it because of the time, but we need to make a major strategic public investment. The idea that private sector drives all innovation is now seen as overly simplistic. We need major public investments in order to shift ourselves towards a low-carbon economy. And the beauty is those two things can start to come together. When you put a price on environmental harm, it'll actually generate significant revenues. A $20 a ton carbon price in Canada would generate around $15 billion, which is about, incidentally, the same as we lost from the 2% cut in the GST, incidentally. So it's money we could use for lots of reasons. Big debate about how you use the money. Obviously, dealing with the equity effects of regressivity is one, tax cuts should be one, but a big chunk of that should go towards a fund to drive public investment towards low-carbon, clean growth and innovation in Canada. And I would argue, and I'll end on this note, the biggest challenge is not how do we do it, but how do we create the political will and space to do that which we know is necessary. There's no simple answer, but the two things I'll leave you with are this. One is, putting a price on carbon is actually not as hard as we've created the mythology around it here in Canada. If you look at the three places that have done it, BC, Alberta, and Quebec, all of them, the governments got re-elected. In Campbell's case, with a big carbon tax, with an increased majority. They were all right-of-center governments, by the way. Think about that one. And then the second thing is that to get the politics out of it, one of the big things we've tried to do in Canada before is to create institutions that take the politics out of these investment decisions. So look at the Bank of Canada, Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, Sustainable Development Technology in Canada. All of them are arm's-length institutions that have a really good track record of making smart investments in other areas that do the kind of things we're going to need to do to drive clean growth. So let's hope that we can summit the same kind of spirit we had in the 90s that allowed us to get ahead of global trends in free trade and deficit fighting through smart public policy decisions. This is the next big global shift, and we need that same kind of leadership in this decade. Thanks.
All right, bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir d'être ici parmi vous. Thanks for the invitation today to speak to you. I want to start you off by asking you to imagine a slightly different world than we have today in Canada. I want you to imagine a world where we decided not to process oil sands in northern Alberta, but instead we followed the typical model of mining, which was to load a bunch of rail cars and to ship the ore for processing somewhere else. And in this particular example, I want you to imagine it moving to southern Ontario. I want you to think about the quantity of oil sands we produce today, about 2 million barrels of oil sands, and translate that into ore. What that would mean would be about 1 billion tons of oil sands ore per year moving from west to east in Ontario, moving from west to east in this country for processing in southern Ontario. You want to put that in terms you'll understand, that's about 275 to 300 100-car-long trains every single day moving oil sands ore from Alberta to Ontario. Now think about the size of the processing infrastructure that you would need to convert that in what we commonly know as value-added jobs. It might not be 1 million jobs, but it'd be close. To convert all of that oil sands ore into a marketable product, a bitumen or a synthetic crude oil. I don't think we'd be having a discussion about energy versus manufacturing. It would be really clear that that was manufacturing, it was value added, it was taking place in a historical manufacturing area, and our level of conflict would be a little bit different with respect to resources in this country if we were managing things that way. It would also probably be very inefficient, but we'll put that aside for now. What I want to talk to you about today centers on this question. It centers on the arbitrary divisions that we tend to draw in this country between manufacturing and energy. And in particular, to push the idea with you, and Madelaine corrected my grammar on this, so I'm going to have to change my title a bit. I was calling it the era of manufacturing energy, but she tells me I should call it the era of manufactured energy, so I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to argue with you that we are entering into, or have entered into in Canada, an era of manufactured energy, and that's going to change and effectively turn on its head the way we think about the relationship between manufacturing and energy resources in this country. So if you go back to the history of energy, in particular in central Canada, the relationship between energy and manufacturing, we have a history of a manufacturing economy underpinned by plentiful resources, and that gave us a comparative advantage. So cheap energy leads to high value-added manufacturing, largely in the core of the economy. And that, combined with a skilled and relatively cheap in global context labor force, was able to create economic growth. That was the engine that drove our economy. What I see us entering into today is an era where that is completely flipping on its head, where we are going to have, we have in this country a vast wealth of natural capital, resource capital in the hydrocarbons, but also more broadly defined. But the way to add value to that, the way in which we're going to realize the value of the wealth, however you want to measure it, that's embedded in that resource base, is through our ability to manufacture it, to effectively process it, and to get it to market. So what I'd like to take you through this thought process a little bit, and I look forward to your comments that will help me shape this idea. But the way I'm thinking about this is initially going to be shaped by essentially two industries. The first two industries, and probably most of you will know where I'm headed with this, are oil sands and natural gas off BC. So it's going to be the oil sands production facilities and the liquefied natural gas. But this isn't a hydrocarbon story as far as I'm concerned. It extends perfectly well to renewable energy technology, energy storage, and even demand-side management and automation fields as well. That our ability to manufacture the means to transfer between resources and energy, usable energy commodities, are going to be more important than anything else to our wealth as an economy. So let me talk to you first about oil sands. So for those of you that don't spend quite as much time in an oil sands rabbit hole as I do, let me put things in broad terms. The oil sands resource is immense. It's about 2 trillion barrels of original oil in place. So to put that in terms you might know, that's about 100 years of our current world oil consumption, give or take. That's if you burned every single barrel of oil in the oil sands. About 10 to 15% of that, so let's say 170 to 300 billion barrels of that, is classified as economically recoverable today. So today's prices, today's technologies, we can get at that resource. So that, again, when you contrast that against current oil production, is still decades worth of world oil production that's available with today's technology. But if you look at how these facilities work, if you actually go up in the oil sands, these are manufacturing facilities. If we were doing this in a factory in Southern Ontario, there would be no question. The workforce, Nick was kind enough to run some data for me last night and to send across some information. If you look at the workforce in an oil sands production facility versus a refinery, an oil sands production facility versus manufacturing in general, they're very similar in terms of education levels, in terms of skill levels, et cetera. The part of the industry which is actually taking a shovel and moving ore into a dump truck and moving that dump truck to the extraction plant is very, very small relative to the totality of it. The way I want you to think about this, though, instead of the value in it being in how much we process it, think of the value of the resource itself. And how is that determined? It's determined by our costs of getting that resource to market. And I'm not going to tell you a pipeline story, don't worry. What I'm going to tell you about is that despite significant technological advances, what we've seen is oil sands extraction costs go through the roof in this country. So if I would have been standing here a decade ago, I would have told you everything's going to be fine in the oil sands sector if only oil prices would stay above how many dollars per barrel? I'd have said 30, because that was the price at which most new oil sands production facilities were deemed to be bankable going forward. I would have told you we were going to produce 5 million barrels a day by 2020 if only we could get $30 a barrel. That number today is we might get to 4 million barrels a day by 2020 if oil prices are $100 a barrel with the same natural gas price. So we've seen oil prices increase substantially. Think of what that does to the valuation of the underlying resource. The price associated with oil has basically tripled, but the value associated with the resource has not moved that much because the cost to get it out of the ground have also gone up. That's a very important change. Sorry, misflipped my notes. So if we look at, we tend to hear a lot about pipelines in this country. We talk a whole lot about pipelines, and I get asked all the time in Alberta, can you come and give a talk about how pipelines are our single greatest, worry, and we should really freak out about this? I can't do that. I've never been able to do that, because whenever I get around to doing it, the thing that worries me the most is the wealth we're losing as a result of extraction cost. You talk about the temporary bitumen price discount. Well, we're talking about $30 to $40 a barrel in changes in extraction costs to get that oil out of the ground. That's a lot bigger than any bitumen discount. Second industry I wanted to talk to you about, one more thing on oil sands. Stewart talked a lot about climate change. And there you can also think about this as a manufacturing challenge. It's a productivity story. It's just not a labor productivity story. It's an energy and resource and water use productivity story that we have to solve in the oil sands if we want to meet some of the goals that Stewart talked about, and if we want to compete in a world that penalizes high emission sources of oil, in addition to, of course, the normal market which penalizes high cost sources of oil. The second market I want to talk briefly about is natural gas and Canada's ability to get our natural gas offshore. Again, go back a decade ago, I would have been standing up here, I would have been asking you this question of how in the world can we run our economy when we're going to have to go overseas and import liquefied natural gas. So you've heard a lot about LNG terminals in Kitimat. The first Kitimat LNG terminal, which was proposed, Alfred Sorensen was the principal proponent of that project, it was proposed as an import terminal. And midway through 2008, he had to go back to his venture capital people and say, yeah, when we were talking about an import terminal, well, now we're going to turn it around and we're going to make it an export terminal. That's how much the market's changed. Why has it changed? It's changed because of technology and innovation, the so-called shale gas revolution, and the ability to extract natural gas in an economically viable manner from tight gas, shale gas deposits. And so now we're in a situation in Canada where, again, we have a vast resource of natural gas, which we used to be able to monetize fairly effectively. I know I moved to Alberta in 2006. We used to be able to monetize this fairly effectively through selling natural gas to the United States. Now, if you look at the data and the projections, the odds are about 50-50 that the US will be a net exporter of natural gas, so that we will in Canada be importing natural gas from from the US. In fact, I just mentioned Alfred Sorensen. Well, his current project is off the East Coast in Nova Scotia at Goldboro LNG. And that facility is a wonderful example of this era of manufactured energy, because Nova Scotia has some natural gas resources in the offshore, but they don't have anywhere near the natural gas resources that are going to supply that LNG plant. About half the LNG moving out of that plant will actually be gas which is imported from the United States. So all of you who have potentially railed about the proportionality clause in NAFTA and how it was set up to make sure that Canada supplied a reasonable amount of energy to the United States, which isn't actually what the clause does, but a lot of people say that. The first test of the proportionality clause under NAFTA for natural gas may likely be this LNG plant, which will look to access market prices for natural gas in the US Northeast and export it off the Canadian coast. So that's a different way of thinking about it. So how is the value of our natural gas going to be determined? It's going to be determined by the world price for LNG and the cost to us to extract it, but then also to process it, so to remove the CO2 and other constituents, to remove the liquids, further processing, and then to liquefy and ship that natural gas. The value at the wellhead is the world price net all of those costs. Right? So if you start thinking of it, 2 points here. One, that's hardly a, quote, rip and ship story that we hear all the time about our resources in Canada. A significant share of the value in those resources is being added already through high margin processing. What we're not doing is the low margin stuff at the far, far end of the value chain. I said I'd get to talking about renewables as well, and I will, because I think this is a primary example of exactly this issue. When you hear people talk about renewable energy, and I think it's the right way to think about it, the fuel is essentially free and available widely throughout the world. Stewart mentioned scarcity. So we have very limited scarcity in access to sunlight. It's going to be pretty hard to charge someone a royalty on access to sunlight. Good wind land's a little more scarce. You might be able to charge a little bit better rent, so to speak, on the wind resource, but again, it's reasonably well distributed throughout the world. Who is going to win out in a renewable energy economy? It's going to be those who develop the technologies and can implement the technologies which most competitively turn those resources into usable energy. It's not going to be the economies necessarily with the most wind or sunlight. There's also a government policy infrastructure story there. So the point I wanted to get across to you, I know this is supposed to be an outward-looking thing, but we tend to think about Canada's future as being exporting energy. And I think to some degree, certainly the energy export story is very important, but I want you to think about the arbitrary rules that we place on what's manufacturing and what's energy, for one, but then the second thing is the importance of our manufacturing skill set and our historic advantage in that area in delivering value into our energy resources. A couple of thoughts I want to leave you with before I get the get off the stage now card from Roland. This isn't by any means a justification or a call for more processing. Do not interpret this as saying we should do more processing. It's exactly the opposite of that. If we are forcing more processing, we're forcing water to run uphill, what we're doing is we're saying we want to do something in Canada which could be more cheaply done elsewhere, but we're going to force that to happen here. And by forcing it to happen here, what are we doing? Well, you could look at it simply and say, wow, we're creating jobs. But I want you to look further back on the supply chain to where it all starts, which is at the wellhead. And what you're doing is you're also devaluing your resource. You're putting a constraint on the contract that says you can buy this resource, but you must do this other thing. In a global market for energy, we can't live in a world where the cost of doing this other thing is not going to back straight up to the value of our resources in that global market. So I guess I'll leave you with that call to say in this era, we are going to need our manufacturing expertise, but not in the way we usually think about it. Thank you.
To adjust it for short people. Well, thank you very much, both Roland Paris and Taylor Owen, for inviting me to comment. I think on my biography it says I'm the Canada correspondent for The Economist, but I suspect that the reason I'm on this panel is I did a report 2 years ago for the Canadian International Council on Resource Policy. And just to put all my cards on the table, that report did recommend that we put a price on carbon. So I have a couple of comments, and they're going to be very short because I don't want to see the card that that comes after "get off the stage now." But I'll have a couple of comments on both papers, and then I want to return to how they might fit together, which I suspect a lot of people are wondering as well. So first on Andrew's paper, which makes the argument that we have to improve how we produce, process, and transport energy to market if we want to get the most value out of our resources. Your point on both hydrocarbons and renewables, that success will not come to those with the resources, but to those who can most effectively create the means to capture those resources and convert them to useful energy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I think it's an important thing that we should stress, because too often in Canada you hear people saying we're a world leader just because we have the resources, and it is important to go back and look at how we're actually dealing with them. Now, there were two things that struck me in the paper, and I'm not sure you actually got to this point in your talk, so at least on the first point, but I'm trying to help with the comments on the paper. So the first was you were listing common elements on which success depends, and you mentioned all the usual suspects: sufficient capital and labor, efficient infrastructure, predictable regulation, climate change policies, and the shift from traditional manufacturing areas to industries. But one thing that sort of jumped out at me is that you didn't mention Aboriginal policies and relations. Not just in Canada, that you didn't mention this. And I do a fair amount of writing about resources and about mining in particular, and not just in Canada, but globally. This Aboriginal policies and relations has become a growing factor in the mining industry. There's been recent studies showing how costly it is to companies if they don't get it right, to companies and then to countries if they don't get this right. And I recently did an exit. It was brought home to me because I recently did an exit interview with Peter Monk from Barrick, and he was sort of reflecting on his 30 years in gold mining. And one of the things that he said, one of the biggest changes for him over those 30 years was the growing clout of Indigenous communities. Now, he thought that was a bad thing. I didn't agree with him on that, but all the same, it's a factor that has to be addressed, I think, when you're talking about, the efficient processing and marketing of our natural resources. And of course, there's plenty of examples of this in Canada already, and the Northern Gateway pipeline springs to mind. So it just left me wondering why this wasn't part of the list of usual suspects. The second thing that struck me, and it sort of goes to the heart of your argument about rising production costs in the oil sands, or the tar sands as the Economist style has it. I get a lot of grief when I write a story about this because The Economist doesn't believe in changing what they call something just because an industry decides that they might want to be referred to something else. So most Economist stories about the oil sands call them the tar sands. Anyhow, I liked your line there about there's being a long history of expecting things to get better or forgetting why they've gotten worse. And you give a lot of figures, and you mentioned some of them here as well, showing how the costs have skyrocketed instead of going down. But I think it would help to know more about why those costs have gone up. and whether there are lessons to be drawn from that particular experience that we should now be applying to the LNG or to other resources. This is probably something that you could rhyme off in your sleep, but for the average reader, they might not know that. So, and it might not have been your remit either, but it would be helpful. Okay, so now on to Stewart's paper. And as I said, I'd already come, in the report for the CIC, I'd already recommended a price on carbon, so you were already preaching to the converted with it in this paper. And I'll just look at one thing that you talked about where you pointed to, when you said that Canada should try to be defined as the most environmentally responsible, reliable supplier of resources. And you pointed to the transformation of the forest industry from, what was it, the environmental piñata of the 90s. And actually, I was working in London, England at the time, and I remember when, I think it was Greenpeace that did a European tour with this big stump that they called Stumpy, and they brought it around to different capitals and that, and it was interesting. They certainly got a lot of attention for it, and the forest industry got an awful lot of bad attention at the same time. But I think here, when we're saying the forest industry did it so the oil sands could do it, I think there's 4 important differences between those two industries. I mean, the one thing is the forest industry had something to work with when they were trying to persuade people that they could go green, you know, that trees grow back. Whereas oil and gas are finite resources, and it's sort of harder to portray them as sustainable just from the very beginning. And also now there's an established reputation. So the task is that much harder for the industry to portray itself as environmentally responsible. Also, the forest industry was in crisis. There were mills closing, and newsprint use was falling through the floor. And often the best time, the easiest time to make drastic changes is when you're in crisis. And Anne Golden was asking before, what changes culture? And I think a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, crisis forces people to change. I know just in the research I was doing for the CIC on the resources report, I was looking at another aspect which was touched on this morning too, about collaboration. And I was looking at how is it that resource companies, forestry companies in Finland were so much more collaborative than traditionally Canadian resource companies have been. And it was explained to me that after the World War II, Finland was forced to pay war reparations to what was then the USSR. And so basically the whole country, but certainly industries, really had to band together to work as efficiently as possible so they could repay these war reparations. And that was a change of culture for them, and it came out of crisis. So I'm not wishing for a crisis in the oil sands, but I think that might speed things along a bit. The fourth thing was there were also socioeconomic reasons for governments to help with that transformation of the forest industry. Specifically, they were trying to save a lot of small one-industry towns or regional economies that would have gone under if they hadn't had help making the transition. Oops, time's up. Okay, so fourth point. I think, and it's related to that I don't know that there's the same amount of government will, or even if government thinks it's important to make that transition for the oil sands. I'm going to end it there because I really don't want to see that other card. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much to Roland and to Taylor for having me out, and thanks for the interesting papers. I'll just start out, I'm going to comment on each in turn. I'll just start out by saying that one of the commentators this morning talked about this talk-do gap and how we've managed to close it in the case of much of Canadian foreign policy. And I think that that's absolutely not the case in the case of climate policy in particular. I mean, I think it's as wide as ever and perhaps widening. So you can think of, for example, the international commitments we made in the 1990s and early 2000s around Kyoto to reduce our greenhouse gases by 6% from 1990 levels. We instead were something like 12% over, missed our target by around 20%. We made similar claims in 2010 at the Copenhagen conference to reduce our emissions by 17% from 2005 levels. We're well on target to blow that commitment way out of the water. There's no evidence to me that our forthcoming commitments, if we make any in Paris and next year, will be any different. It doesn't seem to me like there's any connection between the kinds of policies we adopt domestically and the kinds of talking we're doing internationally. So I think that's interesting. Interestingly, the climate change seems to be a real outlier in that case. Just want to make a couple of comments on Stewart's paper to begin with. His overall claim in the paper version of the paper anyway was that we should adopt a domestic carbon tax, and I couldn't agree more. I think that we have a good sense of the things that make action on climate change affordable, and a good sense of the kind of things that make action on climate change not affordable. So things that make action on climate change not affordable or expensive, having multiple policy instruments, having federal and provincial policy instruments work in opposite directions, having different stringency for different sectors, having inflexible approaches. They're all the things that characterize our current approach on climate change. A carbon tax sends this nice, consistent signal across industry to look for the cheapest sources of reduction. It provides incentives for innovation. It's transparent. It's the kind of thing we need if we're going to have ambitious targets on climate change. So I completely concur with Stewart that that's the instrument we want to choose. The thing that I don't think was brought out enough in Stewart's talk is that instrument choice isn't enough. We need stringency of the instrument if we want to hit a deep target. And so we've committed as a country to a 2-degree global commitment. We've signed on to this commitment. We don't want temperatures to go up more than 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels. To have a reasonable chance of meeting that, we need to keep atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at 450 parts per million. That means around a 60% cut in emissions from today's levels globally by mid-century. For a rich country like Canada, it's, the science doesn't tell us how to allocate emissions burden, but it probably means an equivalent cut. It essentially means more or less completely decarbonizing our economy over the next 40 to 50 years. And to do that, we need a policy signal that's commensurate with that goal. And the recent IPCC work that evaluates all kinds of economic models that look at the strength of policy that we would need suggests policy stringency 2 or 3 orders, or 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher than the magnitude that Stewart was talking about. So double, triple-digit carbon taxes, or even quadruple-digit carbon taxes. So really quite stringent policies. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing I'd like to say is that I think that when we're thinking about what we should be doing around climate change, it's been brought up time and time again that Canada is a small player. Canada's emissions don't really matter, and I think that's true. But I think it's clearly true from a scientific perspective that if we cut all of our emissions to zero, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the climate. But I think what we want to be thinking about is whether our domestic commitments and our domestic policies have any influence on the kinds of commitments, on the kinds of policies that are adopted by other countries. Recent policy, I think, has pushed in the wrong direction. It's our kind of unilateral withdrawal from Kyoto at the last second, and our unproductive actions globally, I think, weaken the case for other countries to act on climate change. So I think we want to rethink that. Our main goal should be to try to promote action by other countries, whether that's through trying to encourage them to do direct action or trying to develop the technologies that make action on their behalf cheaper. So then a couple of comments on Andrew's talk. Andrew's basic argument, as far as I could tell, is that the resource sector increasingly looks like the manufacturing sector. And I think that's true. So in terms of the complexity of the task, for example, I think you can easily make the case that the complexity of extracting oil sands, oil from a couple of kilometers underground, is as complex as the typical manufacturing task. I had a speaker in one of my classes a couple of years ago from the oil sands sector talking about horizontal drilling. And it's incredible what they can do. They can drill 2 kilometers down and then turn 90 degrees, drill 4 kilometers over, and get the drill through a hole the size of a basketball net. So, I mean, compare that to building a table, which is the manufacturing sector, and in terms of complexity of the task, I think it's pretty clear that this is similar in complexity, if not more complex, than the average manufacturing task. But I would argue that there's so that's one dimension that we can compare the two sectors. I'd argue there's other ways we can compare the sectors. So I think the main issue that underlies Andrew's talk is this regionalism, right? There's this conflict in the country about should we be exporting oil because it changes the value of our dollar and makes other manufacturing sectors less competitive. There's a perceived conflict between the interests of Alberta and the interests of Ontario, and I think that's partly inherent to the resource sector in a way that it isn't to the manufacturing sector. You bring the manufacturing sector to where talented people are and to where supply chains are. You don't bring the oil sands to where talented people are and to where supply chains are. People have to go to the oil sands. So oil sands and mining sectors are inherently regional, and I think because of the way we own resources in this country, that promotes some of this regionalism around the resource sectors in a way that isn't promoted around the manufacturing sectors. A second difference between the resource sectors and the manufacturing sectors, and I think it's important, has to do with the volatility of the commodity prices. So we don't see table prices fluctuating 200 or 300% over the course of 10 years, 300%. In case oil prices were $30 a barrel less than 10 years ago, and they went up to $140 a barrel 6 years later or something like that. And this really makes it tricky to rely significantly on a resource sector as the main engine for growth, as Alberta's government has recently found out. They plan their budget around a certain resource price. The resource price doesn't meet their expectations, and there's a big gap in their budget. So this volatility aspect of resources, I think, is qualitatively different from what manufacturers face, and it makes it that much more difficult or challenging to plan an economy around them. And then the third point, and this is one that I was digging around with some data after I read Andrew's paper and set up some of these figures, is that the returns to the resource sectors are really quite different than the returns to the manufacturing sectors. So if you look at the Stats Canada data, around 4/5 of the economic returns from the from the resource sectors goes to owners of capital, whereas around 2/3 of the economic returns from manufacturing sectors goes to employees. And so there's this completely different dynamic, and I think that's part of what breeds the distrust around the resource sector in a way that it isn't bred around the manufacturing sector. It's clear who's benefiting or who's employed or whose resources are employed in the manufacturing sector. They're often the local people. It's less clear whose resources are being employed in the resource sectors because it can be owned by people from all over the globe, and they are owned by people from all over the globe, and it's not there's not that clear link between the sector and its factors of production, its capital or labor. And so I think that's another challenge that the resource sector has to overcome that the manufacturing sector doesn't. So I think I actually haven't seen any signs. I don't know if you forgot to put them up, but but I'm going to end there. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much to Stewart and Andrew and Madelaine and Nick for their responses. I know there's probably a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one to each of the speakers. First to Stewart, as you said, a number of international energy companies have called for some form of carbon pricing, as have a number of political figures, including Jim Prentice in several speeches he gave before he announced his recent move. But most of those oil companies and Mr. Prentice have also said that Canada shouldn't move exclusively to the United States. Canada should move in conjunction with the U.S. in terms of carbon pricing. And we saw Gary Dewar this morning saying that Canada had offered that frequently over the past few years with no uptake. So what is the case for Canada going it alone and bringing in carbon pricing as opposed to trying to coordinate it with our large trading partner that is also now a major energy exporter in its own right with the Bakken and other oil fields? Why would Canada want to price ourselves less competitively than the United States?
You should be answering that question yourself almost, but let me give it a shot. So I'll give, is this working? Yeah, there we go. So 3 answers, I guess. One is, whenever I hear that, I wonder if you were just to substitute the word healthcare policy, social policy, and other places where Canada has not waited for the US to move first, and they've actually proven in many ways to be some of the key things we value as a nation. And so I guess it always seems bizarre to me that climate policy is the one area that we have to be deadly terrified of moving ahead of the US on. I know you weren't suggesting it, you're putting the question out. That kind of rhetorical answer aside, I think 2 things I guess I'd say. One is, I think part of our challenge as a nation is sort of the kid brother challenge living next to the US, and the idea that we could actually do something that was smarter than them is almost hard for us to accept. But shifting your tax system away from income and towards pollution, leaving aside the whole environment, is actually really smart taxing, right? I mean, we should actually be talking about job-killing income taxes. If you want to know what kills a job, it's taxing employing a human being and taxing investment on capital and profit. That kills a job. Taxing pollution kills some jobs. It kills high-polluting jobs. But we may want to kill those jobs. I mean, no, not kill them, but, give them sort of a slow, gradual decline. But so, yes, we would have a different policy in the US, and it would have some upsides and it would have some downsides. But I would argue the upsides of that policy position us for the economy of tomorrow, and it might actually let us think that we could actually do better than the US. So I think part of it is we have to get over our own inferiority complex and realize that we actually could be smarter than the US. And I can tell you, BC isn't running around saying, God, our economy's gone in the tank and the US is eating our lunch because we have a price on carbon that's higher than all of Europe and most of the rest of the world. So, the one experiment we've done with a pretty ambitious carbon tax hasn't played out this deep fear that our economy is going to get sucked south of the border. Yeah, I mean, some people in cement aren't happy about it, but lots of other people say, hey, this is the lowest corporate tax rate in North America. One of them, it's a great place to go and start a business. So I guess that'd be my answer.
Can I jump on that too?
Sure. Yeah.
Just following up on that, I think one of the things you see a lot from in the oil and gas sector is companies are very happy to say, we risk all our projects, or we stress test all our projects with carbon prices, $40 a ton, $70 a ton, whatever that number is. Nobody in Canada has proposed a policy that's as stringent as what the oil companies claim to have stress tested their projects on. So there's only 2 possibilities here. One is that what the oil companies are telling you, that our investments are viable at an average cost of $40 a ton, is not actually true, right? That's one option. Or 2, which is probably the more plausible one, is even if I know my investment is viable at $40 a ton, I'd rather have that $40 a ton in my pocket than yours. And so despite the fact that carbon taxes might not bankrupt the industry, we do have to remember that there is a distribution element here of where does that money go. The last thing I'd point out, and this is relative to the U.S. question, and I think you're bang on this, is if you're looking at any investment, oil sands investment or whatever, you don't really care that much about how you pay money to other people, right? Whether it's through wages, through payroll taxes, through carbon taxes, through income taxes, what have you, you're going to look at what's the rate of return I get on this investment. And so a carbon tax to income tax shift, if it has the same average cost implication for a company, that shouldn't move their investment dial very much at all. If it were a carbon tax shift moved to outside of sectors or outside of regions, then it can really have an impact on that particular investment in that particular area.
Nick, I don't know if you want to jump on for the $1,000 carbon price and what the implication of that would be, but
Is this one working? Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. The IPCC mitigation report, the 3rd report in this last series, just came out last month, and every time they go through all the economic modeling around climate change mitigation to try to figure out how much it would cost to reduce emissions. And so they try to figure out, based on 100 different modeling runs by 100 different groups, what's it going to cost to reach a 750 parts per million target, a 550 parts per million target, 450 parts per million target. Even the 450 million one, which we're more or less at today, so we haven't experienced a temperature change because there's a big lag in the system, but we're more or less at the 450 parts per million concentration today. So stabilizing it more or less means cutting emissions. Not quite, but more or less means cutting emissions to nothing by mid-century, or to significantly by 75% by mid-century. So it's really dramatic. And the cost estimates for that scenario look like around 1.5% of global world product. And so that's not nothing, but it reduces the rate of economic growth worldwide by less than 1/10 of 1% per year. So it's not, even the most dramatic scenario that's envisioned by the IPCC doesn't really have, you wouldn't see it on a graph. It would change the slope of the upward trajectory in gross world product slightly, but not very much. So we can, at an aggregate cost, we can hit deep reduction targets without significantly changing our well-being. And just one last point, I'm talking about cost, but there's obviously an economic benefit from reducing emissions as well. And depending on whose perspective you take, the benefits exceed the costs for fairly significant levels of greenhouse gas reductions.
I want to put a question based on Andrew's paper and maybe get Madelaine to respond as well, and then throw things open to the audience. In your paper, you said this is not a call for further processing, but we do hear this argument all the time. Why shouldn't we have a refinery, off the West Coast, or why should we export bitumen to Louisiana instead of processing it in New Brunswick? What's the argument for it's a good thing to have this highly technologically innovative extraction process, or for oil sands or fracking or the LNG production process, but we don't want to go further and create additional jobs and bring in additional revenue by extracting the maximum benefit along the value chain before we export it out of the country?
Well, I guess the differentiation I'd make is extracting benefit versus distributing benefit. So if you think of the value of a barrel of gasoline, right, that's a fixed quantity on the world market. So if we're going to spend $30 a barrel to upgrade and refine bitumen into gasoline, well, the most that we're going to net out of that transaction is $90 a barrel. And some of that $30 is getting dissipated to Canadian wages and such. If there's a company that can refine that barrel of bitumen into gasoline for $12 or $13 a barrel on the Gulf Coast, yeah, that's fewer Canadian wages, but our barrel of bitumen is also worth a lot more. So the challenge, I think, is really one of distribution more than it is of extracting or creating new value. It's that trade-off between, and Nick highlighted it a little bit, but it's how are we getting at the rents? Are we paying those out in terms of wages to Canadian workers versus profits, taxes, and royalties to Canadian and or otherwise owned oil companies?
I actually asked a lot of people that question when I was doing the research for the report, and the arguments that seemed to make the most sense was just in terms of the oil sands was the capacity already existed in refineries in Texas, so why would we spend more money now? I mean, maybe if the question was asked earlier on, we might have built the refineries, but seeing as the capacity there. The second point that was raised was that, and our experts might know more about this than me, but that companies would prefer to do the ultimate refining and producing of the products closer to where most of the consumers are, and that's not Canada. But just one last point on that whole issue is that it's also been suggested to me that, in fact, those refineries down on the Gulf Coast might have actually been playing sort of a long game with bargaining with Venezuela and Mexico versus Canada, so we have to be a little bit careful about whether we're being used as a bargaining chip there. Anyhow, long answer, short question.
Can I check one more point on that? I think one of the other points that gets missed in this, and I had a great conversation about this with Sephora Berman, who was crucial in the opposition of the forest industry, is when you look at the value of a log versus the value of a table, a lot of the profit, so to speak, and the high margin activities are the ones nearest the end of the value chain. And I think people assume, because they pay a high price at the pump, that there's a whole lot of margin in refining and retail. But if you look through the oil and gas industry, the margin's in extraction. And then if you look at the tax base, well, if you're operating a refinery, it's paying 25% corporate tax. If you're operating an oil sands facility, it's paying 40%, up to 40% in royalties, and then corporate tax on top of that. So if you're shifting resources, so if we're thinking we're scarce in labor, and we're really making a decision between, do I build an extraction facility or do I build a refinery, you're shifting a lot of that profit, you're shifting to a lower profit industry at a lower tax rate with higher wages. So you're moving money around. You're not creating new money.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions that.
Hi, Patrick LeBlanc, University of Ottawa. Madelaine talked about crisis as kind of stimulus for change. My question is about, in a way, distribution, as Andrew talked about. I mean, a lot of questions now with regards to Keystone. I know no one talked about pipelines so much, but isn't there a challenge when looking forward into where are we going to send that stuff? I mean, there's a lot of discussions about creating pipelines and LNG and especially in the oil going, in order to ship to Asia. But, it's not clear, given the politics, that that's going to happen. And then if Keystone doesn't happen because the politics don't look so good, at least for the time being, what does that do to the industry? Because, we can keep taking stuff out of the ground, but if we can't ship it anywhere, or the cost of shipping it by rail increases so much, then, is that going to create a crisis as, the Americans are becoming self-sufficient and potentially net exporters? So what does that do to the Canadian industry as such, and is it going to experience a crisis in the future? Thank you.
I'll take an open crack at that, I guess. I think people tend to ignore the fact that the production forecast is going to be elastic to those conditions. So if the Keystone decision and the Gateway decision are such that, well, now there are no new pipelines. Well, my production's going to adjust as a result. I'm not the companies that are making 25, 30-year investments in an oil sands facility aren't just going to say, well, I'm going to produce the bitumen willy-nilly. I'm not going to worry about how I'm going to get it out. So I don't think that in and of itself can really cause a crisis in the sense of it being a shock on us. I think there are some other things that have come up in the past that could play that role. One of them was when the Waxman-Markey bill in the U.S. had a border carbon adjustment. So this question of, well, could the U.S. actually tax carbon out of our oil sands and use that as essentially a proxy for royalties on our production? That could come outside of our control, and that would be more of, I think, what you're after than pipelines and production, which are more moving in tandem than anything else.
Let me just, if I can just get the mic to work. There we go. So just to build on that, if you look at the things that drove the forest industry, Madelaine talked about an economic crisis, and it was driven to a large extent by declining demand for their product in the U.S. And there was also environmentally induced crisis by environmentalists blocking their sales in the U.S. Well, guess what's happening to the oil industry now? Those same two things, right? The U.S. demand for their product is going down, and U.S. environmentalists are blocking their product from getting to the buyers. It sounds pretty similar. Now, there is not, it was pretty close to the forest transition in the 90s on the litigating end on the other side of it. So I kind of watched it from up close, and I actually, get a chance to talk to a number of the oil CEOs now, and I think they're not fully there yet. They haven't yet hit the tipping point that the forest industry eventually hit, where they said we're better to join them than fight them. I'd say, 2 or 3 of them probably are pretty close to there, and I think they're getting really close to that point. It's hard to predict exactly with the sort of cascade of factors when they'll get there, but I think in a lot of ways, they're not simply passive acceptors of their access problems. A big part of what's fueling certainly the Keystone blockade is the reality and the perception of the oil sands impacts, and the reality and the perception of Canada's poor climate record. If you look, and the Canadian Embassy in Washington's written a memo saying that got leaked, right? So this isn't me making this up. If you were to deal with those two factors, one of which the industry has control over and one of which the government has control over, you wouldn't take all the wind out of the sails of the opposition, but you'd take a lot of it out, right? If we were to be seen as at least a responsible player on global climate policy, and the oil sands industry was able to demonstrate that they were at least getting their environmental footprint to somewhere that it was at least comparable to the rest of the pack. There's 2 words in the campaign, dirty and oil. They're not going to block people who don't like the oil word, but they can deal with the dirty word. And so they have some control over this issue.
Good afternoon. My name is Ron McIntosh, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. And I'm also associated with the China Institute at the University of Alberta. So it's probably in that light. What I'd like to do is, in a sense, take the previous question a little bit further. and that's to ask a question in reverse. And that is I'm sort of tying back to our first session this morning. Can we really have a strategy for emerging economies, or for Asia Pacific in particular, without a more globally oriented and globally capable energy strategy? And the reverse side of that question is, of course, can we really have a solid energy strategy, or environmentally responsible energy strategy for that matter, without an Asia Pacific dimension?
So I'll take a chunk of one part of that. And obviously, an energy strategy that involves Asia requires getting your product to Asia. So there's the access and transport issue becomes a biggie. And so building what I said last time, the West Coast access issue have a different set of dynamics. And obviously the Aboriginal issue is, I think, actually a bigger factor than the environmental issue in terms of the challenge of getting pipeline access to the West Coast. And I won't pretend to try to unpack it all, but let me put one thought out there that at least a significant part of dealing with the Aboriginal land claims in British Columbia, and it's not all of it, but a big part is money, right? I mean, solving these things involves an array of complex social issues, but at the end of it, there's a significant land and money settlement involved. And I guess from a cost-benefit viewpoint, we should be thinking about what the opportunity cost is of not getting that access. You know, we could monetize. There's lots of numbers thrown around about the bitumen discount and Keystone, and 20, 25 billion a year. Numbers like that get thrown around pretty regularly. Let's assume that the opportunity cost is at least that high of not having West Coast access, and weigh that against what it might actually cost to start resolving some of these Aboriginal land claims in a just and more speedy way. It made it actually look like such a bad investment after all, just looking purely at the economic calculus as a nation, leaving aside all the social justice arguments.
Just to follow on a bit on that, absolutely, I think we need to have an Asian energy strategy. But I get a little bit concerned sometimes with the public debate about this, because there seems to be this conclusion that all we have to do is get our energy resources to the coast, and then, of course, we'll have a market. And we're not taking into consideration that other people are already there. They've been there before us. They're doing a better job of making connections. I'm thinking of Australia here with its LNG. You know, you see so many of the reports about the LNG plans for the West Coast, and they're still just plans. And meanwhile, Australia's already supplying that market. So if we are going to develop that strategy, we also have to figure out how it fits into our broader strategy into penetrating those markets, or maybe working with partners or something like that, because we're not going to be able to do it alone.
I guess just to follow on that, I think we have to be careful in that respect of a couple of things. One is to understand that, you know, markets are always evolving. So if we can come to the market with a product that's at a competitive price or competitive stability, we're going to have a home in the market. I mean, Canada didn't have a share of world exports in oil for a long time. We have some now. We'll have more if the product gets there. I agree with you. It's not as simple as just show up at the coast, but you know, there are spot markets for these commodities that are evolving, particularly for LNG, where you do have that ability. Get me to a coast, put it on a boat, someone's going to take it. You know, you might not get a long-term price, but you might get a higher price, you might get a lower price, taking a different risk. You know, I think Stewart's point as well is bang on. I think we could all agree that, you know, if you look at a project like Gateway and say $3.50 or $4 a barrel toll to the West Coast, in today's oil market, if you could ignore all of the environmental costs and you could ignore the risks and you just say this is just seamless, virtually costless access to a premium world market, that'd be great. But we have to look back and say, why is it that we don't have a pipeline to the coast now? And that's because we're only 4 years away from a world where oil traded at Chicago for $2 or $3 or $4 a barrel more than it traded on the coast. And so we have reams of pipeline approvals for pipelines going from Alberta to Chicago that considered West Coast access and decided that that was a poor economic decision for us because we were getting paid a premium to go to Chicago. So the market's flipped, and you know, yeah, we need to reconsider that, but moving infrastructure and that takes a long time as well. So to sit back and say, well, we should have done a lot of things differently, we have to recognize we're in a little bit of a different world now than we were then too.
Can I just ask one thing to tie together this Asian question with some of the carbon questions that we've had? And I think there's a question actually at the front over on the right. One thing that the BC government says is that if some of these LNG projects are built, if 4 or 5 of them are built, that will blow through the carbon emissions levels that the BC government has set for itself. But their argument is this will reduce carbon emissions in China by displacing coal. So how does that trade-off work? Is that a legitimate argument?
That's proof of the cardinal rule in climate policy that if you liked an argument, wait 10 years and it'll be back again. Because some people in the room will remember that we used to make that argument about shipping natural gas to the US under Kyoto. And so our argument was that by exporting natural gas, we were preventing them from using more energy intensive or more CO2 intensive energy sources, and that we essentially looked for credits under the Kyoto Protocol for that. It didn't happen. I think the same's kind of going to be true on the BC coast, that policy wonks can sit down and play with their models and say what would happen if BC didn't export that gas. But when it comes to actually explaining that on the doorstep, that's going to be really hard to do.
It might have worked if they hadn't found all the gas themselves.
I still don't think we would have got credit for it.
So I'm Yves Tibergin from UBC, and from the director of the Institute of Asian Research, and also the chair of a program that we're putting together, public policy school, that's focusing on energy, resources, and Asia. So everything what I have heard so far is music to my ears. So we're moving into a very innovative way, and I'll talk more tomorrow. But I had a question. When a lot of the issues, there are several issues around energy right now, looking at it from BC. One, of course, is transport and access. And we have on one hand, good technology for resource extraction, and then we have markets. And what's missing is the middle piece, right? All the engagement with Aboriginal communities, with environment. A bigger missing piece is also how to avoid, over the long term, the resource curse. And we had that discussion actually with the chief economic advisor to Myanmar, who came to UBC and said, oh, it looks exactly like us. You have to deal with Chinese investment, and you have to avoid the resource curse. You have to deal with Aboriginal communities. And the big question behind all this is, how you make sure that the resources essentially trickle down to the whole economy, to the whole society, and build trust and legitimacy in a larger community. And I think there's still a lot of innovation to do at that level. And is the model maybe a partnership between business and communities around labels? Like, do we have the ocean-wide label for fish, in Vancouver? Or is it with a nudge from government? Or is it through using universities in a novel way and think tanks as a sort of hub linking different partners? I think this is where there's so much more innovation that should be happening and where we can start, right?
Well, that's a lot in that question. Let me take a shot at one part of it, which is the part that's probably the most dangerous, which is the resource curse argument. And I don't pretend to be an expert on it, so I won't get too deeply into it. But let me say one thing. I think one aspect of the resource curse argument is the intergenerational aspect of it. And I think this is the issue where we really are missing the boat in a fundamental way. We are liquidating a one-time non-renewable resource, and any notion both of sort of long-term economic thinking and intergenerational justice suggests that we should be taking the one-time rents we're going to get from that and investing them in a way that will actually benefit the next generation. Because they're going to absorb a lot of the environmental costs associated with that. So they ought to at least get a good chunk of the benefits that come from it too. The irony of it is Norway tends to get held up as the example of how you do that right. And I'm told, I don't have firsthand knowledge, that they came over and looked at what Alberta was doing when they set up their own trust fund. And Alberta subsequently after that flatlined their trust fund and stopped continuing to build it. But the idea that we should be taking some of those rents, not just in Alberta, but the federal part of the rent, and I would say, to me, this idea of a strategic government investment helping to drive us towards the economy of the future is really critical. And in a time of kind of record public and private debt load in the country, where we're going to get the resources to do that is a huge challenge. And so the rents that come from resource extraction, including oil extraction, in some ways can be directed towards building a next generation low carbon economy that will actually provide the jobs for the future. It will provide jobs for kids and will position us to prosper after the oil is gone. So that doesn't solve the entire present part of the resource curse problem to the extent it exists, but it solves, or at least begins to solve, the future part of it.
Madeleine's report mentioned Norway about 90 times.
Pardon me?
I said Madeleine's report mentioned Norway about 90 times. So.
Yeah, no, but I just want to make a very brief comment on that about public support for that idea. I don't know how many people follow the Northwest Territories government policy here, but they had actually set up the structure for a sovereign wealth fund, I guess a year ago, in anticipation of devolution that happened on April 1st, where they would now be getting the revenues from their resources. And the finance minister brought out the budget earlier this year, and he finally said, okay, we're only going to put, well, he didn't say only, he said we're going to put 5% of our resource revenues into this fund. Within a week, he had to change the budget because there was such an outcry, he had to increase it to 25%. So for politicians that say that there isn't support for this sort of idea, I think I mean, okay, it's a small example, but it showed that the public does want to save some of that money.
I think, can I take a crack at this? I think just on the savings question, I've made this point a couple times already related to distribution versus quantities or what have you. And I think that's an issue here as well. Just because rents aren't saved in a giant government fund doesn't mean they're not saved. Just because they're not invested by a giant government fund in the future doesn't mean that they're not invested in the future. So the real question is, I think, are two. One, do we like the distribution of current resource rents? Which is, one, it's provincial. Why is it provincial? Look back at history. It's provincial because Ontario and Quebec didn't want to share rents with the West. It's not because the West didn't want to share it with the East. And then, that's the reality of it. And then look and say, is that how we like it provincially? But then within the provinces that own those resources, are they doing a good job of distributing those rents? And then the third question or highlight, and my Maclean's colleague Colby Kosh has made this point really well, which is the difference between Alberta and Norway is it's very difficult to define a future Albertan. I wasn't an Albertan until 6 or 8 years ago. It's very easy to define a future Norwegian. And from the point of view of political license, it's very easy for a Norwegian government to say, we're going to save for your children and your grandchildren. My children are Albertans. I wasn't born an Albertan. I don't know if their children will be Albertans. So taking money from current Albertans to save for future Albertans is very different than taking money from current Albertans to save for their children and grandchildren. And that, I think, does create a political wedge that isn't present in some of the models that we use as sort of the go-to.
Is that an argument for it to be done nationally?
Hey, if you wanted the resource rents, you could have had them about 100 years ago.
I think there's one question immediately behind Roland, and then if we can do that quickly, and then we'll wrap it up.
Errol Mendes, Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. And this is one question I actually want the moderator to partly answer. Robert Greenhill this morning, made a very profound issue when he said that the CEO of Barrick Gold, Monk, said the most powerful force facing the mining sector is the connection between Aboriginal groups around the world, which really reflects a world perspective on energy and a whole bunch of other issues, which we have to take very seriously. On the other hand, we have a perspective by the present federal government that tax is a dirty word. And in part, perhaps the moderator can ask us, how did we get there? And one of the reasons why I fear for this growing clash with pipelines, with energy, is the two clashing perspectives are heading straight for each other. And until we actually deal with how you make those different perspectives socially acceptable to all Canadians, so in other words, how do you integrate? We talked about integrative leadership this morning. How do you integrate the perspective of First Nations with the duty to consult, which places a much higher emphasis on their worldview against the view of some of the business community, which says we're losing $50 billion if we don't get those pipelines through, and with the government's view which could have provided a solution that any form of tax, carbon tax, is a dirty word. So how do you reconcile all that to make all these issues something which is socially acceptable to the entire Canadian population?
My only comment would be that since this government has come into power, not only has this government said that tax is a dirty word, but all political parties have, and we have the Liberals and the NDP both saying that they won't raise personal taxes, and that no province has stepped into the 2% of sales tax that was vacated except for 1% in Manitoba. So I think it seems to be a fairly widespread consensus that at least increasing personal taxes is almost a no-go area politically, and I don't think that's one government. I think that's responding to a broad consensus in public opinion, because otherwise you'd see other parties stepping in, or other governments stepping in to take some of that tax room. But I'll let others respond as well.
Well, I guess, I agree with you generally, right? That sort of the great quote that taxes are the prices we pay for civilized society is one I ascribe to. But I also think Mark probably reads the political tea leaves more accurately, that we're not in a time and space right now that there's a lot of political space to do that. But to me, the easier question, though, is not about how much we tax, it's what we tax, right? And this idea that we could accomplish a lot of these things simply by changing what we tax rather than by adding to the total tax load is big. And I guess I just want to finish by coming back to the stringency issue that was left out there, because I think there's a danger, much as I agree with all the modeling that we ultimately have to get to a carbon price that's up in the hundreds in order to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius world, there's a danger of two things. One is making the perfect the enemy of the good. I mean, we have been talking about various forms of carbon pricing in this country over for a decade. In a Liberal government, it would have happened largely if the environmental movement hadn't blocked the proposal that was put out by Martin and Dion for not being stringent enough. It now looks awfully good in hindsight. And Alberta's system, which looked like it was horrible in hindsight, is now held up as they were the first movers, and at least they have one. So the lesson I've learned from that is a big part of this challenge is just getting started, right? Just get started. And what's holding us back a lot of this is a fear of the unknown. There's this kind of bogeyman that a world with a carbon price in it will be this job-killing, destructive world. And as long as no one actually has to set foot in that world, it's easy to believe these hypothetical worst-case scenario fears. And if you never set foot across the Rocky Mountains, you can believe that until you actually step into a place that lives with a $30 a ton carbon price and the sky hasn't fallen. So I actually would be a big proponent of just get started. Start with a modest carbon price, and there's a really good economic argument for it too, which I know Nick will actually agree with me probably, is that in the short term, the kind of adjustments we want can't happen, right? I mean, the technology turnover we need is going to take 10, 15 years. And so what you really want is to send a price signal that people can believe in 10 years from now, so that when they're making investments today, they can know the carbon price world they're going to live in tomorrow. So don't scare them today by trying to put that price on in the short run.
I guess I'd come back quickly to Nick's point about the say versus do gap, that sure, let's get started with something, but let's also make sure that we're not promising the $100 a ton results while we're implementing the $10 a ton carbon tax. And that's, I think, the recurring problem in our discussions is we have $15 a ton ambition and $100 a ton or plus targets. And until we get away from that, you're not going to get out of this mold where people are looking at you and saying, well, your oil sands are still growing, but we're just getting started. The second thing I'd say is, well, remember that BC and Alberta both put these programs in with this view that the price was going to increase over time. BC's did for a bit and is now stalled. Alberta's never did. In fact, it's got cheaper in real terms, and now they're having trouble getting to an escalated price. So just getting started and expecting it to be easy to raise those prices in the long run, I don't think is as obvious as it might be, even though I agree that it'd be a good way to go.
I agree with both those points, and I'll just make one quick point about the political acceptability. The recent polling numbers I've seen suggest that more than half of Canadians are willing to accept a carbon tax. It's hard to gauge support at particular levels because it's hard to convey what that kind of stringency means, but I don't think it's as toxic an issue as we've made it out to be.